This project is an attempt to decolonize our minds. It is to force us to see that the liberated nations of Europe were themselves, during the Second World War and just after, brutal colonist empires that committed atrocities on a massive scale. The methods, the ideology of racial superiority, the industrial-scale cruelty were as bad as those of the fascists they fought. We need to expose those who have proclaimed themselves the absolute good guys of this history. It is an act of epistemic justice. The front of the postcard. We see the delighted crowd of the Champs-Élysées. The French flag flies high. Tears of joy stream down faces. It is May 1945, the end of the Nazi occupation. But on this side, just a year later, in the streets of Sétif in Algeria, another crowd gathers. They too carry flags. They too seek dignity and liberation after years of oppression. But for them, there was no victory, only massacre. The French state, freshly liberated itself, responds to this call for freedom with brutal colonial force. The celebrations in Paris were paid for with blood in Sétif. Thousands of Algerians were killed. We all remember the first photograph of liberation, but I'm sure you didn't know about the massacre in Sétif, which it was no anomaly. It was the same brutal colonial logic applied in a desperate bid to maintain control. By the way, next time you watch Casablanca, please notice how the singing of La Marseillaise is a powerful symbol of anti-fascist resistance. Yet, this celebration of liberty takes place in a Moroccan cafe under the roof of the French colonial empire, an empire that was itself an oppressive prison for millions, Great Britain. On the front side of the postcard, we see salvation. The British Army liberating Belsen in 1945. This image of defeating a monstrous regime became a pillar of memory, a testament to British honor. But on this side, we see the same hand, under the same flag, building a system of horror. Just a few years later, in 1950s Kenya, the British colonial government established a network of camps during the Mau Mau rebellion. They were not places of liberation, but of brutal repression. Behind these wires, tens of thousands of Kenyans were detained in squalid conditions, exposed to systematic torture, rapes, starvation, and forced labor. This was a British-designed system to break a people's struggle for freedom. This is not a coincidence, but a pattern. In 1943, Winston Churchill presided over the Bengal famine that killed millions, a crisis he blamed on the victims, calling them beasts who bred like rabbits. And let's not forget that conservative estimates say the British Empire's actions led to over 100 million deaths. Belgium. On this side of the postcard, we see Belgium as a victim. In this photograph taken in 1941, we see a woman and her children depicted fleeing the ruins of their occupied homeland, a universal image of loss. But simultaneously, another story unfolds in the Congo. In Elizabethville, Congolese miners, whose labor was powering the Allied war effort, protested for better conditions. The response was a massacre, where hundreds were gunned down by the Belgian colonial force publique. This violence was not an isolated event. It was the direct legacy of the brutal system born under King Leopold II, a system that taught a horrific lesson through the cutting off of hands for rubber. That Congolese bodies were disposable. They were only valued for what could be extracted from them. So, at the very moment Belgium was a victim of aggression in Europe, it was a perpetrator of violence in Africa. The nation fighting for its own freedom was denying freedom to others. Now is the turn of Holland, and the front of the postcard shows a picture of innocence, that of a nation brought to its knees, its citizens humiliated, being rounded up by German soldiers, the ultimate victims of intolerance and aggression, a powerful image of a small nation crushed by the boot of fascism. But this is the other Holland, the one we airbrushed out of the postcard. Just 3 years after its own liberation, Dutch soldiers are not the victims, but the victimizers. In the village of Rawajid, Indonesia, they are the ones doing the rounding up. They are the ones aiming the rifles. They were the ones who committed the massacre. They assassinated 431. And these men were not soldiers, they were just civilians, including children as young as 15. They were executed for the crime of wanting freedom for their own country. So let's not forget that the good vibrations of liberal Amsterdam were paid for by the silent graves of Rawajid, cemented by the atrocities in South Celebes during 1946 and 47, and founded on the decades of terror from the Aceh War. And to understand the depth of this hypocrisy, just look at this photograph taken in South Celebes. Observe the Dutch soldier on the right. See his smile. This is not a picture of anguish or conflict, but a man content in his work. It is a smile that reveals a terrifying truth. For the colonizer, the annihilation of others could be just another day's labor. We end with the USA, and an image of pure triumph. Times Square, New York, at the end of the war. The boulevards are a river of delighted soldiers and civilians. They celebrate the victory. It is a perfect image of the winner. But this celebration came at a price not shown in the photo, a price they did not pay. While confetti fell all over New York, a nuclear silence descended upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where over 300,000 lives, mostly civilians, were evaporated in seconds or condemned to a slow death. And in the years that followed, while they consolidated their American dream, their agencies were already busy plotting against other countries, as they did in Iran, where in 1953 the CIA overthrew the constitutionally elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh just for nationalizing Iranian oil. Or in 1954, when he repeated the operation in Guatemala against Jacobo Arbenz, his crime implementing a land reform that affected the interests of the United Fruit Company. And already in 1960, it orchestrated the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, the country's first democratically elected prime minister. And of course, that is what they call democracy and freedom. And you may wonder, why don't I mention the Soviets? When they have been established as the baddies for years, what is there left to repeat? The point is simple. To mention them is to step into a propagandistic trap set over 45 years of the Cold War, a discourse that still today seeks only to undermine alternatives to capitalism. A discourse that tellingly has always downplayed the single greatest sacrifice of the war, that the Soviet Union lost more people in World War II than all other Western allied nations combined, multiplied by 3. But hey, it was the Western forces who won the war. To finish this work, let me be absolutely clear. This is not an attempt to excuse the horrors of fascism. And I know this not as an abstraction, but as a Spaniard. The legacy of Franco's regime is a living memory for my people. I know the cost too well. However, we must tear down the comfortable wall that separates good and evil in our history books, because that wall is a lie. And I will end with a passage from Discourse on Colonialism by Aimé Césaire, one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, often ignored by a white, Eurocentric canon. He said, "What the bourgeois civilization cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist methods which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the blacks of Africa. As you can see, Césaire is ripping away the last veil, that the unspoken rule of the world system they were defending was a rigid racial order. The horror was not that Hitler was practicing brutality, but that he was doing it on the wrong people. It was business as usual when the victims were black, brown, and the countless millions across Asia.